Chapter 3. When Jesserac and his parents had faded from view, Alvin lay for a long time, trying to hold his mind empty of thought. He closed his room around him, so that no one could interrupt his trance. He was not sleeping. Sleep was something he had never experienced, for that belonged to a world of night and day, and here there was only day. This was the nearest he could come to that forgotten state, and though it was not really essential to him, he knew that it would help compose his mind. He had learned little new. Almost everything that Jesserac had told him he had already guessed. But it was one thing to have guessed it, another to have had that guess confirmed beyond possibility of refutation. How would it affect his life, if at all? He could not be sure, and uncertainty was a novel sensation to Alvin. Perhaps it would make no difference whatsoever. If he did not adjust completely to Diaspar in this life, he would do so in the next, or the next. Even as he framed the thought, Alvin's mind rejected it. Diaspar might be sufficient for the rest of humanity, but it was not enough for him. He did not doubt that one could spend 1,000 lifetimes without exhausting all its wonders, or sampling all the permutations of experience it could provide. These things he could do, but if he could not do more, he would never be content. There was only one problem to be faced. What more was there to do? The unanswered question jolted him out of his reverie. He could not stay here while he was in this restless mood, and there was only one place in the city where he could find some peace of mind. The wall flickered partially out of existence as he stepped through to the corridor, and its polarized molecules resisted his passage like a feeble wind blowing against his face. There were many ways in which he could be carried effortlessly to his goal, but he preferred to walk. His room was almost at the main city level, and a short passage brought him out onto a spiral ramp which led down to the street. He ignored the moving way and kept to the narrow sidewalk, an eccentric thing to do since he had several miles to travel, but Alvin liked the exercise, for it soothed his mind. Besides, there was so much to see that it seemed a pity to race past the latest marvels of Diaspar when you had an eternity ahead of you. It was the custom of the city's artists, and everyone in Diaspar was an artist at some time or another, to display their current productions along the side of the moving ways, so that the passers-by could admire their work. In this manner, it was usually only a few days before the entire population had critically examined any noteworthy creation, and also expressed its views upon it. The resulting verdict, recorded automatically by opinion sampling devices which no one had ever been able to suborn or deceive, and there had been enough attempts, decided the fate of the masterpiece. If there was a sufficiently affirmative vote, its matrix would go into the memory of the city, so that anyone who wished, at any future date, could possess a reproduction utterly indistinguishable from the original. The less successful pieces went the way of all such works. They were either dissolved back into their original elements, or ended in the homes of the artist's friends. Alvin saw only one objet d'art of his journey that had any appeal to him. It was a creation of pure light, vaguely reminiscent of an unfolding flower. Slowly growing from a minute core of color, it would expand into complex spirals and curtains, then suddenly collapse and begin the cycle over again. Yet not precisely, for no two cycles were identical. Though Alvin watched through a score of pulsations, each time there were subtle and indefinable differences, even though the basic pattern remained the same. He knew why he liked this piece of intangible sculpture. Its expanding rhythm gave an impression of space, even of escape. For that reason, it would probably not appeal to many of Alvin's compatriots. He made a note of the artist's name and decided to call him at the earliest opportunity. All the roads, both moving and stationary, came to an end when they reached the park that was the green heart of the city. Here, in a circular space over 3 miles across, was a memory of what Earth had been in the days before the desert swallowed all but Diaspar. First, there was a wide belt of grass. Then, low trees which grew thicker and thicker as one walked forward beneath their shade. At the same time, the ground sloped gently downward, so that when at last one emerged from the narrow forest, all sign of the city had vanished, hidden by the screen of trees. The wide stream that lay ahead of Alvin was called, simply, the river. It possessed, and it needed, no other name. At intervals it was spanned by narrow bridges, and it flowed around the park in a complete closed circle, broken by occasional lagoons. That a swiftly moving river could return upon itself after a course of less than 6 miles had never struck Alvin as at all unusual. Indeed, he would not have thought twice about the matter if at some point in its circuit the river had flowed uphill. There were far stranger things than this in Diaspar. A dozen young people were swimming in one of the little lagoons, and Alvin paused to watch them. He knew most of them by sight, if not by name, and for a moment was tempted to join in their play. Then the secret he was bearing decided him against it, and he contented himself with the role of spectator. Physically, there was no way of telling which one of these young citizens had walked out of the Hall of Creation this year, and which had lived in Diaspar as long as Alvin. Though there were considerable variations in height and weight, they had no correlation with age. People were simply born that way, and although on the average the taller the person the greater the age, this was not a reliable rule to apply, unless one was dealing in centuries. The face was a safer guide. Some of the newborn were taller than Alvin, but they had a look of immaturity, an expression of wondering surprise at the world in which they now found themselves that revealed them at once. It was strange to think that, slumbering, untapped in their minds, were infinite vistas of lives that they would soon remember. Alvin envied them, yet he was not sure if he should. One's first existence was a precious gift which would never be repeated. It was wonderful to view life for the first time, as in the freshness of the dawn. If only there were others like him, with whom he could share his thoughts and feelings. Yet, physically, he was cast in precisely the same mold as those children playing in the water. The human body had not changed, not at all in the 1,000,000,000 years since the building of Diaspar, since the basic design had been eternally frozen in the memory banks of the city. It had changed, however, a good deal from its original primitive form, though most of the alterations were internal and not visible to the eye. Man had rebuilt himself many times in his long history, in the effort to abolish those ills to which the flesh was once heir. Such unnecessary appurtenances as nails and teeth had vanished. Hair was confined to the head. Not a trace was left on the body. The features that would most have surprised a man of the dawn ages was, perhaps, the disappearance of the navel. Its inexplicable absence would have given him much food for thought, and at first sight he would also have been baffled by the problem of distinguishing male from female. He might even have been tempted to assume that there was no longer any difference, which would have been a grave error. In the appropriate circumstances, there was no doubt about the masculinity of any male in Diaspar. It was merely that his equipment was now more neatly packaged. When not required, internal stowage had vastly improved upon nature's original, inelegant, and, indeed, downright hazardous arrangements. It was true that the reproduction was no longer the concern of the body, being far too important a matter to be left to games of chance played with chromosomes as dice. Yet, though conception and birth were not even memories, sex remained. Even in ancient times, not 1/100th part of sexual activity had been concerned with reproduction. The disappearance of that mere 1% had changed the pattern of human society and the meaning of such words as father and mother, but desire remained, though now its satisfaction had no profounder aim than that of any of the other pleasures of the senses. Alvin left his playful contemporaries and continued on towards the center of the park. There were faintly marked paths here, crossing and crisscrossing through low shrubbery, and occasionally diving into narrow ravines between great lichen-covered boulders. Once, he came across a small polyhedral machine, no larger than a man's head, floating among the branches of a tree. No one knew how many varieties of robot there were in Diaspar. They kept out of the way and minded their business so effectively that it was quite unusual to see one. Presently, the ground began to rise again. Alvin was approaching the little hill that was at the exact center of the park, and therefore of the city itself. There were fewer obstacles and detours, and he had a clear view to the summit of the hill and the simple building that surmounted it. He was a little out of breath by the time that he reached his goal, and he was glad to rest against one of the rose-pink columns and to look back over the way he had come. There are some forms of architecture that can never change because they have reached perfection. The tomb of Yarlin Zay might have been designed by the temple builders of the first civilizations man had ever known, though they would have found it impossible to imagine of what material it was made. The roof was open to the sky, and the single chamber was paved with great slabs which only at first sight resembled natural stone. For geological ages, human feet had crossed and recrossed that floor, and left no trace upon its inconceivably stubborn material. The creator of the great park, the builder, some said, of Diaspar itself, sat with slightly downcast eyes, as if examining the plans spread across his knees. His face wore that curiously elusive expression that had baffled the world for so many generations. Some had dismissed it as no more than an idle whim of the artists, but to others, it seemed that Yarlin Zay was smiling at some secret jest. The whole building was an enigma, for nothing concerning it could be traced in the historical records of the city. Alvin was not even sure what the word tomb meant. Jesserac could probably tell him because he was fond of collecting obsolete words and sprinkling his conversations with them, to the confusion of his listeners. From this central vantage point, Alvin could look clear across the park, above the screened trees, and out into the city itself. The nearest buildings were nearly 2 miles away, and formed a low belt completely surrounding the park. Beyond them, rank after rank in ascending height, were the towers and terraces that made up the main bulk of the city. They stretched for mile upon mile, slowly climbing up the sky, becoming ever more complex and monumentally impressive. Diaspar had been planned as an entity. It was a single, mighty machine. Yet though its outward appearance was almost overwhelming in its complexity, it merely hinted at the hidden marvels of technology without which all these great buildings would be lifeless sepulchres. Alvin stared out towards the limit of his world. 10, 20 miles away, their details lost in distance, were the outer ramparts of the city, upon which seemed to rest the roof of the sky. There was nothing beyond them, nothing at all except the aching emptiness of the desert, in which a man would soon go mad. Then why did that emptiness call to him, as it called to no one else whom he had ever met? Alvin did not know. He stared out across the colored spires and battlements that now enclosed the whole dominion of mankind, as if seeking an answer to his question. He did not find it. But at that moment, as his heart yearned for the unattainable, he made his decision. He knew now what he was going to do with life.